Clean my shoes first, then maybe you can listen to grown men talk business, the millionaire said, without even looking at her. The words cut through the quiet of the luxury hotel suite, like cold metal sliding across glass. The long marble table was covered with crystal glasses and scattered documents from a private investment meeting that had started 2 hours earlier. Outside the tall windows, the city lights of Chicago shimmered across Lake Michigan. But inside the room, the atmosphere was thick with impatience and arrogance. Elena Brooks stood near the doorway holding a small cart with cleaning supplies, the scent of lemon polish faint in the air around her. She had entered quietly the way hotel staff were trained to do, invisible and efficient, but Alexander Volkov had noticed the spill on the floor and snapped his fingers without turning his head. The men seated around the table chuckled softly. To them, she was not a person. She was simply the maid. Elena stepped forward and knelt beside the chair where the dark stain of spilled whiskey glistened under the chandelier light. Her movements were calm and practiced, a folded cloth in one hand, a small bottle of cleaner in the other. As she wiped the polished wood floor, the voices of the businessmen continued above her like distant thunder. The language shifted suddenly. English disappeared, and another rhythm filled the room. Sharp consonants, rolling vowels, a language that most Americans rarely heard outside of films or international news broadcasts. Russian. The men leaned closer to one another, their voices dropping lower now that they believed nobody around them could understand a single word. One of them laughed quietly. Another tapped the edge of a thick contract lying open on the table. Alexander Volkov poured himself another glass of whiskey, unaware that the conversation unfolding beside him was no longer meant for his ears. Elena kept her head down, her cloth moving slowly across the floor, but something in her posture changed. Her shoulders stilled for a fraction of a second. The voices above her were no longer meaningless sounds. Every word was clear, every sentence sharp as glass. She listened as one man described a clause buried deep in the investment agreement. A clause designed to transfer catastrophic liability onto Volkov's company if the deal collapsed. Another man asked if the American billionaire had noticed the trap. The answer came with a quiet laugh. No, he is too proud to read carefully. The laughter spread around the table, low and confident. Elena felt a chill move through her chest as the meaning of the conversation settled in her mind. The man who had just ordered her to clean his shoes was seconds away from signing away a fortune without realizing it. She lowered her eyes again and continued wiping the floor as if she had heard nothing at all. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Elena wrung the cloth into a small bucket, the faint sound of dripping water echoing softly in the polished room. Above her, the Russian voices continued, careless and amused. One of the businessmen leaned back in his chair and said something that made the others burst into quiet laughter again. Elena understood every word. She also understood the danger of speaking. Housekeeping staff were not supposed to interrupt guests, especially not during private meetings involving men who controlled companies worth billions of dollars. She was supposed to finish cleaning and disappear through the service hallway like a ghost. But the words she had just heard would not leave her mind. The contract on the table rustled as Alexander Volkov turned another page, unaware that the men beside him were watching with hidden smiles. Elena slowly lifted her head. For a brief moment her eyes moved toward the open document on the table. And that was the moment the quiet maid realized she was the only person in the entire room who knew the truth. Elena Brooks kept her eyes lowered as she finished wiping the last trace of whiskey from the polished floor, but the conversation above her continued in quiet Russian, careless and confident, as if the men believed the language itself had built an invisible wall around their words. One of them tapped the edge of the contract again and spoke with a tone that carried both arrogance and amusement, explaining that the liability clause was buried deep within the agreement, disguised with legal phrasing that would shift catastrophic financial responsibility onto Alexander Volkov if the project failed. Another voice responded that the American investor would never notice because wealthy men like him trusted their instincts more than their lawyers. A low ripple of laughter followed, and Elena felt the meaning of every sentence settle into her chest like cold stone. She finished wringing out the cloth and stood slowly, her cart still beside her, the wheels squeaking softly against the marble floor. No one looked at her. In their eyes, she was part of the furniture, another silent worker moving through the room without consequence. Alexander Volkov lifted his glass and studied the final pages of the agreement spread across the table, unaware that the men seated beside him had already decided how this evening would end. Elena glanced briefly toward the contract, just long enough to confirm what she had already heard. The clause was there exactly where the man had said it would be, hidden within a block of dense legal language that most readers would skim without a second thought. Her heart began to beat faster. She understood what the clause meant. If Volkov signed that document, the liability would shift entirely onto his company, and if the venture collapsed, the financial damage could destroy everything he had built. She pushed the cleaning cart a few inches back toward the wall, telling herself that none of this was her responsibility. She was a maid working the late shift at a hotel. Men like Alexander Volkov lived in a world far above hers, a world of private jets and billion-dollar deals. It was not her place to interfere. One of the Russian businessmen leaned forward and said something else that made the others smile. This time the words were sharper, describing exactly how the trap would close once the signature appeared on the final page. Elena felt her stomach tighten. The casual cruelty in their voices made the room feel smaller. She looked toward Volkov again. The billionaire turned another page slowly, his expression focused but impatient, as if he were eager to finish the meeting and move on to something more interesting. The chandelier light reflected off the polished surface of the table, illuminating the line where his signature would soon go. Elena swallowed and forced herself to breathe slowly. She remembered the rules every hotel employee learned on their first day. Do not interrupt guests. Do not involve yourself in private conversations. Do not create problems for management. Breaking those rules could cost someone their job. She thought about her mother waiting at home in their small apartment on the south side of Chicago, about the medical bills stacked beside the kitchen sink and the night shifts Elena had taken just to keep up with rent. Losing this job would mean losing everything. Another burst of Russian laughter drifted across the table. One of the men said something that made the others nod with satisfaction, confident that the deal was already finished. Elena realized that in a matter of minutes Alexander Volkov would sign the document and walk straight into the trap they had carefully prepared for him. The realization settled heavily in her chest. She could stay silent and leave the room the way every maid was expected to do, or she could speak and risk the anger of powerful men who would never forgive being corrected by someone they believed was beneath them. Elena felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her shoulders. The cloth in her hand had gone completely still. Across the table, Alexander Volkov reached for the pen resting beside the contract. The tip hovered just above the paper as he prepared to sign his name. Elena lifted her eyes from the floor, and for the first time since entering the room, she looked directly at the billionaire. In that moment, she understood that if she remained silent, the room would stay comfortable and polite, but the truth would disappear forever the second the ink touched the page. The pen hovered above the paper for a moment that seemed to stretch longer than it should. Alexander Volkov leaned slightly forward in his chair, his attention fixed on the contract while the men around him watched with quiet anticipation. The room was so still that Elena Brooks could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant traffic far below the hotel windows. The cleaning cloth was still in her hand. The wheels of her cart rested against the wall beside her. Everything about the moment felt fragile, like a glass balanced on the edge of a table. If she said nothing, the pen would touch the page and the deal would be done. She felt her heart beating harder inside her chest. The Russian voices that had filled the room minutes earlier had now fallen silent, replaced by polite expressions and controlled patience. The businessmen sat straight in their chairs as if nothing unusual had been said. Elena knew better. She understood every word they had spoken. She understood the trap waiting inside that contract. Her mind raced through the consequences of speaking. She could already imagine the reaction. A maid interrupting a meeting between powerful investors. A maid questioning a billionaire in front of his business partners. The humiliation would be immediate. The manager would probably fire her before the meeting even ended. Yet the thought of walking out of the room while the trap closed felt heavier than the fear of losing her job. Alexander Volkov lowered the pen slightly closer to the paper. The shadow of the chandelier trembled across the polished table surface. Elena felt something inside her settle into a quiet decision. She stepped forward before her fear could stop her. The small sound of her shoe against the marble floor echoed through the room. The movement was enough to draw several annoyed glances from the businessmen. One of them frowned as if irritated that the maid had not already disappeared. Alexander Volkov paused, but did not look up. Elena took another step closer to the table. Her voice when it came was calm, but clear. "So you should not sign that document." The words hung in the air like a sudden crack of thunder. Alexander Volkov slowly lifted his head. The pen froze in his hand. Around the table the Russian businessmen exchanged startled looks. For a brief second nobody spoke. The silence felt almost physical, pressing against the walls of the room. Volkov stared at Elena as if trying to understand whether he had heard correctly. "Did you just speak to me?" he asked quietly. Elena held her ground, even though she could feel the attention of every person in the room turning toward her. "Yes, sir," she said carefully. "I believe that agreement contains a clause that transfers full liability to your company if the project fails." The reaction was immediate. One of the Russian investors let out a short laugh that sounded forced. Another leaned forward sharply and said something in Russian under his breath. Elena turned her head slightly and answered in the same language. Her voice was smooth and fluent, the words flowing with natural precision. The men around the table froze. Their expressions shifted from amusement to disbelief in an instant. Alexander Volkov blinked once slowly, as if trying to process what he had just heard. The maid standing beside the table had not only interrupted his meeting. She had just spoken flawless Russian in the middle of a room full of businessmen who believed they were the only ones who understood it. One of the investors pushed back slightly in his chair, his face tightening with sudden tension. Another stared at Elena as though the floor itself had started talking. Volkov slowly lowered the pen and set it beside the contract without breaking eye contact with her. The room that had been filled with quiet arrogance only moments earlier now felt uncertain and unsteady. Finally, Alexander Volkov spoke again, his voice slower this time. "You understand Russian?" he asked. Elena met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, sir," she replied. "And what they were just discussing was how that contract is designed to destroy you after you sign it." The words settled over the table like a sudden drop in temperature. For several seconds nobody moved. Alexander Volkov stared at Elena Brooks, as if the world had tilted slightly off balance. The Russian businessmen who had been relaxed and confident only moments earlier now sat stiff in their chairs. One of them cleared his throat and forced a thin smile, attempting to recover control of the moment. "That is a serious accusation," he said in careful English. The maid must have misunderstood what she heard. Elena did not look at him. Her eyes stayed on Volkov. "Sir, the liability clause appears harmless on the surface," she said calmly, "but the wording transfers all legal responsibility for any future losses to your company alone. If the project collapses, every lawsuit, every financial penalty, every operational failure would become your burden." The man who had spoken first leaned forward quickly, his expression tightening. "That is not correct," he said sharply. "The contract has been reviewed by attorneys. A maid is hardly qualified to interpret international agreements." The comment was meant to restore the old hierarchy of the room. A maid should be invisible again. Yet something in Volkov's expression had already begun to change. Instead of dismissing Elena, he slowly reached for the contract again and flipped back through several pages. His movements were slower, now more careful. The room remained silent except for the faint rustling of paper. Elena stood beside the table with her hands loosely folded in front of her apron. Inside she could feel her pulse beating fast, but her voice had remained steady, and now there was nothing more she could add. The truth was already in the document. Volkov stopped turning pages and leaned closer to the contract. His finger traced a paragraph near the center of the page. The Russian businessmen watched him closely. The quiet confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone. One of them shifted in his chair and said something softly in Russian that sounded like a warning. Elena understood every word. He was telling the others that the situation was becoming dangerous. Volkov read the clause again and again. The muscles along his jaw tightened slightly. He looked up toward the men across from him. "Explain this section," he said. The man who had laughed earlier straightened in his chair. "It is standard language," he replied smoothly. "Protection for both parties." Elena spoke again before the conversation could move past the moment. "Sir, that sentence begins by describing mutual protection," she said, "but the following paragraph removes that balance." The phrase operational responsibility in that context transfers the full legal burden to your side if the project fails. Volkov's eyes flicked toward her, then back to the document. His finger moved slowly across the line she had described. For several seconds he said nothing. The businessmen across the table were no longer smiling. One of them leaned toward another and whispered urgently in Russian, asking whether Volkov had noticed the trap. Elena remained silent, but the words echoed clearly in her mind. Finally Volkov closed the contract halfway and leaned back in his chair. The movement was small, but it carried the weight of a shifting tide. The pen that had nearly signed the document now rested untouched beside the folder. He looked directly at the men seated across from him. His voice when he spoke was calm, but colder than before. Why did none of you mention this clause earlier? The question hung in the air unanswered. The Russian businessmen exchanged brief glances. One of them began to respond, but Volkov raised his hand, slightly stopping him. His eyes moved slowly back toward Elena Brooks, the maid who had interrupted his meeting. For a moment, the powerful billionaire simply studied her, as if seeing her for the first time. The room that had once treated her as invisible was now focused entirely on the quiet woman standing beside a cleaning cart. Volkov leaned forward again and turned the contract back toward himself. His voice dropped lower. "Show me exactly where you saw it," he said. Elena Brooks stepped closer to the table slowly, careful and deliberate, aware that every movement she made was now being watched. The wheels of her cleaning cart remained near the wall, forgotten for the moment as the attention of powerful men followed her across the polished floor. Alexander Volkov had turned the contract toward her, his finger resting near the center of the page. The thick paper reflected the chandelier light above, and the room had fallen into a silence so complete that Elena could hear the faint ticking of a decorative clock mounted on the far wall. She stopped beside the chair and leaned slightly forward, careful not to touch the document, until Volkov nodded once in quiet permission. Elena lifted her hand and pointed to a section halfway down the page. Her voice was steady, even though she could feel the tension in the room tightening around her. "The clause begins here," she said. "It describes operational responsibility in neutral language, which makes it appear balanced. But the next sentence changes the meaning." Volkov followed the line with his eyes as she spoke. The Russian businessmen across the table watched in growing discomfort. One of them shifted in his chair and spoke quickly in Russian, insisting that the maid did not understand the complexity of the agreement. Elena did not look up. She continued speaking in calm English. "This sentence removes the shared liability between both parties," she explained. "It states that if the venture encounters financial or regulatory failure, the operational responsibility falls entirely on the primary investor. In this contract, that means your company alone." Volkov read the sentence slowly again, his eyes narrowing slightly as he absorbed the structure of the wording. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the quiet movement of paper as he adjusted the page. Then he flipped to the previous section of the contract and compared the language. The men across from him were no longer relaxed. One of them leaned toward another and whispered urgently in Russian that the situation was becoming dangerous. Elena understood every word, but she remained silent now that she had shown him where to look. Volkov exhaled slowly through his nose. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone than before. Earlier he had sounded impatient and dismissive. Now he sounded careful. "How did you notice this?" he asked without looking up from the document. Elena hesitated for a moment before answering. "I heard them discussing it when they believed nobody in the room understood Russian," she replied. A ripple of tension moved across the faces of the businessmen. One of them straightened abruptly. "This is absurd," he said. "The maid is inventing stories to appear important." Volkov raised his hand again without lifting his eyes from the contract. The gesture was small but commanding enough to silence the interruption immediately. He read the clause one more time. Then he slowly closed the folder and placed it flat on the table. The soft thud of the document settling against the polished surface sounded louder than it should have in the quiet room. Volkov finally looked up. His gaze moved from one businessman to another. The confidence that had filled their expressions earlier had vanished completely. When he spoke, his voice was controlled but unmistakably cold. "You expected me to sign this without noticing the transfer of liability," he said. None of the men answered. Their silence confirmed more than any explanation could have. Volkov leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. For several seconds, he simply studied them, the weight of the moment pressing down on the entire room. Then his attention returned to Elena Brooks. The maid who had entered quietly with a cleaning cart now stood beside the table, having stopped a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Volkov's eyes lingered on her with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. A few minutes earlier he had ordered her to clean his shoes. Now she had revealed a deception that his entire legal team had missed. Finally he spoke again, his voice softer but filled with genuine surprise. "You heard all of this while cleaning the floor?" he asked. Elena nodded once. "Yes, sir," she replied. Volkov studied her for another long moment. The silence in the room had changed completely. What had begun as a meeting between powerful businessmen had turned into something none of them expected. And in that quiet moment Alexander Volkov realized that the least powerful person in the room had just saved him from a catastrophic mistake. The silence that followed Elena Brooks' answer lingered in the air like a held breath. Alexander Volkov leaned back slowly in his chair, his gaze still fixed on the quiet woman standing beside the table. The contract remained closed in front of him, its thick pages now carrying a weight very different from a few minutes earlier. Around the table the Russian businessmen avoided his eyes. Their confidence had evaporated, replaced by a cautious stillness that filled the room. One of them finally cleared his throat and attempted to recover control of the situation. "This misunderstanding has clearly created confusion," he said carefully. "Perhaps we should continue the discussion privately at another time." Volkov did not respond immediately. Instead, he placed one hand on the contract and tapped the cover lightly with his fingers, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to echo through the quiet room. His attention moved across the faces of the men seated across from him, studying each expression with calm precision. A few minutes earlier they had laughed at the idea that he might notice the trap hidden in their agreement. Now none of them seemed eager to meet his gaze. Finally Volkov spoke, his voice steady and controlled. "There will be no continuation tonight," he said. "This meeting is finished." The words landed with quiet authority. One of the businessmen shifted in his chair as if preparing to protest, but the look in Volkov's eyes stopped him before he could speak. The tension in the room shifted again, this time with a clear direction. Chairs moved softly as the men gathered their papers and folders. Their earlier arrogance had disappeared completely, replaced by stiff politeness and hurried gestures. Within a minute the investors who had arrived expecting to celebrate a successful agreement were moving toward the door in silence. None of them looked at Elena as they passed. The heavy door closed behind the last man with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have. The suite became quiet again. The large table that had been crowded with voices now held only two people: Alexander Volkov and the maid who had stopped him from making the worst decision of his career. Elena remained standing beside the table, unsure whether she should leave or wait for instructions. Her cleaning cart still stood near the wall where she had left it earlier, the faint scent of lemon polish lingering in the air. Volkov studied her for several long seconds. The anger that had briefly flashed in his expression earlier had faded into something more thoughtful. He reached forward and opened the contract again, turning the pages slowly as if confirming for himself that the clause she had identified was real. After another moment, he closed the folder once more and set it aside. Then he looked up at her again. "You understood their entire conversation?" he asked. Elena nodded once. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. Volkov leaned back slightly in his chair. His expression held genuine curiosity now rather than irritation. "You listened while cleaning the floor and understood a financial discussion conducted in Russian," he said slowly. "That is not something most people can do." Elena hesitated for a moment before answering. "I spent part of my childhood in St. Petersburg," she explained. "My father taught language at a university there. He believed that understanding another language meant understanding how people think." Volkov watched her carefully as she spoke. Something about the calm confidence in her voice suggested a story far more complicated than the uniform she was wearing. After a moment, he nodded slightly, acknowledging the explanation without pressing further. Then he glanced toward the cleaning cart waiting near the wall. "You came here to mop the floor," he said. "Instead, you prevented a disaster that could have cost my company hundreds of millions of dollars." Elena lowered her eyes slightly, uncomfortable with the attention. "I only said something because it felt wrong to stay silent," she replied. Volkov studied her for another quiet moment. In a world where powerful men spent entire careers searching for advantage, The simple honesty of that answer seemed almost unfamiliar. Finally, he stood from his chair. The movement broke the stillness of the room. Elena instinctively straightened her posture, unsure whether she was about to be thanked or dismissed. Volkov walked slowly around the table and stopped a few feet from her. The billionaire who had earlier ordered her to clean his shoes now looked at her with a completely different expression. "Tell me something, Elena Brooks," he said. "Why is someone who can analyze a contract written in 2 languages working the night shift as a maid in a hotel?" Elena Brooks lowered her eyes slightly when Alexander Volkov asked the question. For a moment she did not answer. The quiet of the hotel suite seemed deeper now that the other businessmen had gone. Outside the tall windows, the lights of Chicago stretched across the dark surface of Lake Michigan, and somewhere far below, a distant siren echoed through the city. Elena folded her hands together in front of her apron, the fabric of her uniform still faintly smelling of cleaning solution. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, but carried the weight of something older than the moment. "Life does not always move in a straight line, sir," she said softly. Volkov watched her closely. He was used to quick answers in business meetings, confident explanations supported by charts and contracts. Elena's response was different. It sounded more like the beginning of a story. She glanced briefly toward the cleaning cart near the wall, as if reminding herself why she was standing in the room at all. "When I was younger, my father believed languages could open every door," she continued. "He taught Russian literature and linguistics at a university in St. Petersburg. Our apartment was small, but filled with books. Every night he would read to me in 2 languages, so that I would hear how meaning changed depending on the words people chose." Volkov listened without interrupting. Elena's voice remained steady, but there was a quiet distance in her eyes as she spoke, as if she were looking at another place far away from the hotel suite. "When I was 18, my parents moved back to the United States," she said. "I enrolled in a university program in international relations. My plan was to work in diplomacy or international trade." For a moment she paused, choosing her next words carefully. "But during my 2nd year, my father became sick. The illness came quickly, and the medical costs came even faster." Elena lifted one hand slightly, then lowered it again. "I left school to work full-time," she said. "The first job I could find was in housekeeping at a hotel. It was supposed to be temporary." Her voice faded slightly on the last word. Volkov studied her expression and understood the rest without needing to hear it explained. Temporary work often had a way of stretching into years when life became complicated. Elena continued quietly. "After my father passed away, my mother needed help with rent and medical care. I kept working nights because the schedule allowed me to be home during the day. It was not the future I imagined, but it was the one my family needed." The room fell silent again. Volkov rested one hand against the back of a chair, absorbing the simple honesty of her story. In the world he moved through, people rarely spoke so directly about the sacrifices they had made. Most conversations were filled with negotiation or strategy. Elena's words carried neither. They were simply true. After a moment he spoke again. "You never returned to school?" he asked. Elena shook her head gently. "No, sir," she said. "Life became busy, and time moves quickly when you are trying to hold everything together." Volkov looked toward the contract resting on the table, then back at her. The contrast between the 2 images seemed almost impossible to ignore. A multimillion-dollar agreement that nearly destroyed his company had been stopped by the quiet observation of a woman pushing a cleaning cart through a hotel corridor. "You understand financial language," she said earlier, he continued. "And you noticed a legal structure that experienced investors failed to question." Elena gave a small, uncertain shrug. "My father believed that words reveal intention," she said. "When people choose language carefully, it usually means they are hiding something." Volkov allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile at that answer. He had spent decades negotiating deals around the world, and he knew the truth hidden inside her simple observation. Words could build fortunes or destroy them, depending on how they were arranged. He looked at Elena Brooks again, this time with a deeper level of curiosity than before. The maid who had walked into the room unnoticed now stood before him as someone far more complicated than her uniform suggested. For several seconds he said nothing. Then Alexander Volkov asked a question that would change the direction of the night entirely. "If someone gave you another chance," he said slowly, "would you still choose to work in international negotiations?" Elena Brooks did not answer immediately. The question Alexander Volkov had asked seemed to linger in the quiet space between them. For a moment she looked down at her hands, the faint lines of cleaning solution still drying on her skin, and the contrast between those hands and the future he had just described felt almost unreal. Outside the windows, the wind moved gently across the dark water of Lake Michigan, carrying the distant glow of city lights into the room. When Elena finally spoke, her voice was soft but honest. "Yes, sir," she said. "I would choose it again." Volkov studied her expression carefully. He had spent decades watching people negotiate, bluff, and hide their intentions behind carefully rehearsed answers. Elena's response carried none of that calculation. It was simple and direct, the kind of answer that came from someone who had already lived through disappointment and still believed in possibility. "Why?" he asked quietly. Elena lifted her head slightly and met his gaze. "Because understanding people matters," she said. "When people from different countries sit at a table, they bring more than contracts with them. They bring history, pride, fear, and sometimes hidden motives. My father used to say that language is not only about words. It is about the spaces between them." Volkov listened with interest as she spoke. Elena continued slowly, choosing each sentence with care. "When I studied international relations, I believed negotiation could prevent conflict. I believed that if the right people understood each other clearly, then fewer mistakes would happen." She paused for a moment before adding with a faint smile, "Tonight proved that mistakes still happen even when people think they understand everything." Volkov allowed a small breath of amusement to escape him. There was truth in that observation. He walked slowly back toward the table and rested one hand against the polished surface, looking down briefly at the contract that still lay closed beside his chair. A few minutes earlier he had been seconds away from signing it. The realization of how close he had come to disaster was still settling in his mind. Then he looked back toward Elena. "You stopped a deal that would have damaged my company for years," he said. "You did it without being asked and without expecting anything in return." Elena shook her head gently. "I only spoke because it felt wrong to stay silent," she replied. Volkov nodded, once as if confirming something to himself. In business, he had met many intelligent people and many ambitious ones, but integrity was far more difficult to find. He moved away from the table again and walked slowly toward the tall windows that overlooked the city. For several seconds, he stood there looking out at the lights below. Elena remained near the cleaning cart, unsure whether she should return to her work or wait for him to speak again. Finally, Volkov turned back toward her. His expression had changed slightly. The irritation that had filled his voice earlier in the evening had completely disappeared. In its place was a calm focus that suggested he had reached a decision. "Elena Brooks," he said, "your father was correct about one thing. Words reveal intention. Tonight your words revealed honesty." He walked back toward the table and picked up the closed contract once more. With a calm motion he placed it into a leather folder and set the pen beside it. "That agreement will never be signed," he said firmly. Elena felt a quiet sense of relief move through her chest. The tension that had filled the room earlier had finally begun to dissolve. Volkov studied her again, his eyes thoughtful. Then he asked another question that seemed almost unexpected. "When was the last time you read a negotiation contract in full?" he asked. Elena hesitated briefly before answering. "During my second year at the university," she said. "It was part of a class on international trade agreements." Volkov nodded slowly, as if connecting pieces of a puzzle in his mind. "You recognize the language structure tonight, because you have seen it before," he said. Elena gave a small nod. "Yes, sir," she replied. Volkov looked toward the cleaning cart, near the wall, then back at her again. The difference between the life she had planned and the life she was living was impossible to ignore now. For several seconds he said nothing. Then Alexander Volkov made a decision that neither of them had expected when the evening began. "Elena Brooks," he said calmly, "if I offered you the chance to sit on the other side of that table tomorrow, would you be ready?" The question seemed to change the gravity of the room. Elena Brooks stood still beside the cleaning cart, unsure whether she had heard Alexander Volkov correctly. The idea of sitting at the same negotiation table where powerful investors had been arguing only minutes earlier felt almost impossible to imagine. For a moment she searched his face, expecting to find sarcasm or amusement, but there was none. Volkov's expression remained calm and serious. Elena felt the familiar instinct to step back from the opportunity, the same instinct that had taught her to remain quiet and invisible in rooms where powerful people spoke. Her life during the past few years had trained her to avoid attention rather than invite it. She lowered her eyes briefly and and took a slow breath. So she said carefully, I have not studied those materials for several years. The world of international finance moves quickly. Volkov listened without interrupting. Elena continued slowly, choosing her words with caution. I remember the principles, but experience matters in negotiations like the one you were about to sign tonight. The people who sit at those tables usually have entire teams supporting them. She paused for a moment, then added honestly, I am not certain I would belong there. The answer did not surprise Volkov. He had seen that hesitation many times before in people who had spent years being underestimated. Confidence was often shaped by opportunity as much as ability. He walked slowly back toward the table and rested his hand against the back of a chair. Elena Brooks, he said quietly, a few minutes ago you analyzed a contract written in 2 languages while standing beside a cleaning cart. You noticed a hidden liability clause that experienced investors ignored. That tells me something about your instincts. Elena remained silent, but she felt the weight of his words settling in her mind. Volkov continued speaking with the calm authority of someone used to making decisions that affected entire companies. Negotiation is not only about experience, he said. It is about perception, the ability to notice what others overlook. Tonight you demonstrated that ability. Elena glanced briefly toward the closed leather folder containing the contract. The document that had nearly changed Volkov's financial future now looked almost harmless resting on the table. She knew how close the situation had come to disaster. Still she hesitated. My responsibilities are different now, she said softly. My mother depends on my income, and this job provides stability. Volkov nodded as if he had expected that answer as well. Stability is important, he said. But stability should not trap someone in the wrong life forever. The quiet confidence in his voice made Elena look up again. Volkov studied her for a moment before speaking again. Tell me something, he said. When you heard those men speaking Russian earlier tonight, did you hesitate because you feared losing your job? Elena answered honestly. Yes, sir, she said. And yet you spoke anyway, he replied. That decision carried more risk than anything I am proposing now. The truth of that statement lingered between them. Elena thought back to the moment when the pen had hovered above the contract. She had known exactly what could happen if she interrupted the meeting. Yet she had spoken because the situation felt wrong. Volkov watched her expression carefully and seemed to recognize the moment when her thoughts returned to that decision. Opportunity often appears disguised as inconvenience, he said quietly. Tonight you expected to clean a floor. Instead you exposed a deception worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Elena felt a small, uncertain smile appear despite herself. That was not the plan when I arrived at work tonight, she said. Volkov allowed himself a faint smile in return. No, he agreed. But sometimes the unexpected moments reveal who we really are. He stepped closer to the table again and opened the leather folder. The contract remained inside, but he removed a blank sheet of hotel stationery instead and placed it on the table. Then he picked up the pen that had nearly signed the disastrous agreement. Elena Brooks, he said, tomorrow morning my legal team will review a new proposal for this investment. I want someone in the room who understands the language behind the words. He set the pen gently on the blank paper and looked at her with steady certainty. The question is not whether you belong at that table. The question is whether you are willing to claim the seat that you have already earned. Elena Brooks looked down at the blank sheet of hotel stationery resting on the polished table. The pen beside it was the same one that had almost sealed the disastrous agreement only minutes earlier. The room still carried the quiet tension of what had nearly happened. Outside the tall windows the night over Chicago had deepened, the city lights glowing like scattered stars across the dark water of Lake Michigan. For several seconds Elena did not move. Her mind traveled through years of choices and sacrifices that had slowly guided her life away from the path she once imagined. She thought about the apartment she shared with her mother, the long night shifts at the hotel, the textbooks she had packed away in a cardboard box when she left the university. Opportunity had once felt distant and fragile. Now it stood in front of her in the form of a simple question. Volkov watched her quietly, giving her the space to consider the moment. He had learned long ago that important decisions required silence more than pressure. Finally, Elena lifted her eyes. Sir, she said carefully, if I sit at that table tomorrow, it will not be as someone pretending to understand. I will ask questions. I will challenge language that feels unclear. I will speak when something appears wrong. Volkov nodded once without hesitation. That is exactly why I asked you to be there, he replied. Elena took a slow breath. The weight of responsibility in his voice felt real. A negotiation involving millions of dollars could affect employees' families and entire companies. It was not a game. But the same responsibility had guided her decision earlier when she interrupted the meeting. Integrity did not change depending on the room a person stood in. Elena reached toward the pen on the table and turned it slightly between her fingers before placing it back where it had been. "I will come tomorrow," she said. The words were simple, but they carried a quiet determination that had been building inside her since the moment she heard the Russian conversation earlier that evening. Volkov studied her expression carefully. The hesitation that had filled her voice earlier had been replaced by calm resolve. "Good," he said. "Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock my legal team will meet in the conference room on the 32nd floor. I want you there before the meeting begins so that we can review the revised proposal together." Elena nodded slowly, absorbing the instructions. The thought of entering a conference room filled with attorneys and financial advisors would have frightened her a few hours earlier. Now it felt like the natural continuation of a responsibility she had already accepted. Volkov glanced briefly toward the cleaning cart near the wall and then back at her. "For tonight," he said, "your shift is finished." Elena blinked in surprise. "Sir, the floor still needs to be cleaned," she replied instinctively. Volkov allowed himself a small smile. "The floor can wait until tomorrow," he said. "Tonight you have already done more than enough work." Elena felt a quiet warmth move through her chest at the unexpected kindness in his tone. She walked toward the cart and placed the cloth and cleaning bottle neatly back into the tray. The routine movements grounded her thoughts as the reality of the evening slowly settled in. When she turned back toward the table, Volkov was gathering the remaining papers from the meeting. The leather folder containing the contract was now closed securely beneath his arm. Elena paused near the doorway before leaving the room. "Sir," she said softly. Volkov looked up. "Thank you for listening earlier tonight," she added. "Many people would not have." Volkov considered her words for a moment before answering. "Leadership requires knowing when to listen," he said quietly. And tonight the most important voice in the room did not belong to the person with the most power. Elena gave a small nod and stepped into the hallway. The door closed gently behind her, leaving the suite silent once again. As she walked down the corridor toward the service elevator, the hotel looked exactly the same as it had at the beginning of her shift. The carpets were quiet beneath her steps, and the distant sound of conversation drifted from other rooms. Yet something inside her had changed. The woman who had entered the building that evening expected nothing more than another routine night of work. The woman walking toward the elevator now carried the possibility of a different future waiting on the next floor above. The elevator doors closed softly as Elena Brooks stepped inside, the quiet hum of the descending car filling the small metal space. For a moment, she simply stood there holding the railing lightly, watching the numbers change above the door. The events of the evening replayed in her mind like scenes from another person's life. Only a few hours earlier, she had been pushing a cleaning cart through silent hotel hallways preparing for another ordinary shift. Now she carried an invitation that could change the direction of her future. When the elevator reached the lobby, she stepped out and walked through the quiet marble corridor toward the employee exit. The night air outside the hotel felt cool against her face as she crossed the street toward the bus stop. Chicago was quieter at that hour, but the city still moved with a steady rhythm of distant traffic and glowing streetlights. Elena sat on the metal bench and looked down at her hands resting in her lap. For years those hands had scrubbed floors, polished tables, and folded linens. Tonight they had pointed at a line inside a contract that almost cost a billionaire his company. The realization felt unreal. Yet the opportunity waiting the next morning felt even more fragile. She knew the world she was about to step into could be difficult and unforgiving. Conference rooms filled with attorneys and investors were not gentle places. But she also knew that silence had never built a better future for anyone. When the bus finally arrived, she climbed aboard and took a seat near the window. The ride across the city was quiet and gave her time to think. By the time she reached the small apartment building where she lived, the sky had begun to lighten slightly above the rooftops. Elena climbed the narrow stairs and opened the door carefully so she would not wake her mother. The apartment was modest but warm, filled with the familiar scent of tea and books that had belonged to her father. On the kitchen table, a stack of unopened mail waited beside a lamp. Elena placed her bag down and sat for a moment staring at the envelope pile. Medical bills had a way of multiplying faster than hope. Yet tonight something felt different. She walked quietly into the next room, where her mother slept, and paused in the doorway. The older woman breathed slowly beneath a blanket, her face calm in the dim light. Elena felt a wave of quiet determination rise inside her. Everything she had done during the past few years had been for this family. If the opportunity Volkov offered truly existed, she would take it not only for herself, but for the people who depended on her strength. The next morning arrived sooner than she expected. Sunlight filtered through the small kitchen window as Elena dressed in the only formal outfit she still owned from her university days. The jacket was slightly older than she remembered, but it still fit well enough. She tied her hair back neatly and glanced at herself in the mirror beside the hallway. The woman staring back at her looked both familiar and new at the same time. When she arrived at the hotel, the lobby already buzzed with the quiet activity of early business meetings. Employees moved quickly between the reception desk and the elevators carrying folders and coffee trays. Elena paused for a moment near the entrance, feeling the weight of the decision she had made. Then she walked toward the elevators that led to the upper conference floors. When the doors opened on the 32nd floor, she stepped out into a hallway lined with glass walls and polished stone. At the far end, a large conference room, doors stood slightly open. Voices drifted from inside. She recognized one of them immediately. Alexander Volkov was already there. Elena took a slow breath and stepped forward. Inside the room, a group of attorneys and financial advisors sat around the table reviewing documents. The moment she entered, several heads turned toward her with visible confusion. A woman carrying a tablet frowned slightly, as if trying to understand why someone from housekeeping had appeared in the middle of a corporate meeting. Before anyone could question her presence, Volkov looked up from his seat. His expression shifted into calm recognition. "Good morning, Elena Brooks," he said. "Please take the chair beside me." The room fell silent once again. The silence inside the conference room stretched for a long moment after Alexander Volkov spoke. Several attorneys looked from him to Elena Brooks and back again, their expressions shifting between confusion and curiosity. The chair beside Volkov remained empty, waiting. Elena felt every pair of eyes in the room studying her uniform and the simple jacket she had chosen to wear that morning. A few hours earlier, she had worried about whether she belonged there. Now the answer to that question depended on what she did next. She stepped forward calmly and took the seat beside Volkov. The leather chair felt unfamiliar beneath her, but she kept her posture steady. One of the senior attorneys cleared his throat and looked toward Volkov with visible hesitation. "Sir," he said quietly, "are we expecting additional consultants for this negotiation?" Volkov folded his hands on the table and spoke with calm certainty. "Yes," he replied. "Elena Brooks will assist with reviewing the language of the agreement." The attorney looked surprised, but said nothing further. A stack of printed documents lay in the center of the table, and one of the advisors slid a copy toward Elena. She opened the folder slowly and began reading. The structure of the contract felt familiar even after several years away from academic study. The language of international agreements always carried the same careful rhythm. Sentences that looked balanced often hid deeper implications beneath their surface. Elena read each paragraph with patient focus. Around the table, the discussion resumed as the legal team outlined a revised version of the investment proposal. They spoke about regulatory frameworks, international shipping routes, and projected financial returns. Elena listened quietly at first, absorbing the details while her eyes continued moving across the printed pages. After several minutes, she noticed a phrase buried within a section describing supply obligations. The wording was subtle, but it carried an implication that could later shift responsibility during a dispute. Elena raised her head slightly. "Sir," she said quietly, addressing Volkov, "may I ask a question about the wording in Section 8? The conversation around the table paused. Volkov nodded once. "Go ahead," he said. Elena pointed to the line inside the document. "This sentence describes shared supply responsibility," she explained, but the phrase delivery verification authority appears to grant final control to the secondary partner. If a dispute occurs, that language might allow them to deny responsibility for delays. The attorneys leaned forward, examining the page she indicated. One of them adjusted his glasses and read the paragraph again more carefully. "You are correct," he admitted after a moment. "That phrasing could create an imbalance later." Volkov watched the exchange quietly. The same instinct that had revealed the hidden clause the night before was now guiding Elena through the language of the new agreement. The attorneys quickly began discussing how to adjust the wording. As the meeting continued, Elena spoke only when something required attention. Each observation she offered was precise and thoughtful. Slowly the atmosphere in the room changed. The earlier confusion about her presence faded and was replaced by a quiet respect. The people around the table realized that the woman sitting beside Volkov was not there by accident. Nearly an hour later, the final revisions were complete. The contract language now reflected a balanced agreement that protected both sides from hidden liability. Volkov reviewed the pages carefully before placing the pen on the table once more. This time there was no hesitation in his movement. He signed the document calmly and slid it toward the other attorneys for verification. When the meeting concluded, the legal team gathered their materials and began leaving the room. Several of them paused briefly to nod respectfully toward Elena before departing. Within minutes, the large conference room grew quiet again. Volkov remained seated at the table, studying the finished contract. Finally, he turned toward Elena Brooks. "Yesterday you walked into a room carrying a cleaning cart," he said quietly. "Today you helped negotiate a multimillion-dollar agreement." Elena looked down at the document resting on the table. The distance between those two moments still felt difficult to measure. Volkov leaned back slightly in his chair and allowed himself a small, thoughtful smile. "I believe your father understood something many people forget," he said. "The person who truly listens in a room often understands more than the person who speaks the loudest." The conference room slowly emptied until only two people remained. Elena Brooks sat quietly beside the long, polished table, her hands resting gently on the closed folder that contained the final version of the agreement. Across from her, Alexander Volkov stood near the tall glass window that overlooked the city. The morning sun had climbed above the skyline of Chicago, casting long beams of light across the buildings and reflecting softly across the surface of Lake Michigan. The city below moved with its usual rhythm of traffic and distant voices, unaware that inside the quiet conference room a life had quietly shifted direction. Volkov turned from the window and walked back toward the table. For several seconds he studied Elena with the thoughtful expression of someone measuring the true weight of a moment. "Yesterday evening," he said, "you walked into a private meeting carrying a cleaning cart. No one in that room expected to notice you." Elena looked down briefly at the folder in front of her. She remembered the moment clearly. The spilled drink on the floor, the laughter in Russian, the pen hovering above the contract. Volkov continued, speaking in a calm, reflective tone. "And yet that quiet moment changed everything. You heard something others ignored. You spoke when silence would have been easier." Elena lifted her eyes. "It still feels strange," she admitted. "Last night I thought I might lose my job for interrupting that meeting." Volkov allowed a faint smile. "Instead, you saved my company from a mistake that could have cost hundreds of millions of dollars." He reached down and slid a thin envelope across the table toward her. Elena looked at it with curiosity before opening it carefully. Inside was a printed letter bearing the official heading of Volkov International Holdings. She read the first line slowly, her eyes widening slightly as she continued. The letter offered her a position as a language and negotiation analyst within the company. The salary described in the document was more than she had earned in several years working night shifts at the hotel. Elena sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the meaning of the words. Volkov watched her reaction, but did not interrupt the silence. Finally, she looked up again. "Sir, I do not know what to say," she said softly. "You do not need to say anything," he replied. "Your actions already spoke clearly last night." Elena folded the letter carefully and held it in both hands. "My father always believed language could change the world," she said quietly. Volkov nodded once. "Sometimes it does," he replied. "But more often it simply changes one life at a time." He walked toward the door and paused before leaving the room. "Elena Brooks," he said, "one more thing. The world often overlooks the quiet people standing in the corner of the room. But those are sometimes the people who understand the truth better than anyone else." Elena rose slowly from the chair and looked out the window again at the city stretching far beyond the glass. A day earlier, she had entered the hotel expecting nothing more than another ordinary night of cleaning floors. Now she held the beginning of a future she had once believed was lost. The cleaning cart was no longer waiting in the hallway. The conference room was silent again. But the path ahead of her was finally open. And somewhere in the quiet memory of the previous night, a simple truth remained clear. The billionaire had mocked the maid for being invisible. Yet in the end, the quiet woman with the cleaning cloth was the only person in the room who truly understood what was happening.